To understand self-esteem, we need to start by looking at its historical ontology. This phrase, historical ontology, means examining how an idea came into existence and became meaningful over time. So, the historical and ontological analysis finds that self-esteem's emergence as a critical psychological construct was closely tied to the increasing popularity of self-psychologists and humanistic psychologists in the 19th century. Now, behaviorists used to be mainly interested in the observable behavior, things like what do people do, how do they respond, and how behavior can be shaped. But self and humanistic psychologists became more interested in people's inner world. So, how do people experience themselves, how do they judge themselves, or how do they make meaning of who they are? Um, so, within this group of psychologists, Maslow was quite influential in the creation or the inception of the self esteem construct. During his time, he took or undertook clinical interviews to investigate self-esteem, and he called it the dominance feeling in his earlier works. So, according to Maslow, self-esteem was something that is expressed as high self-confidence, extroversion, masculine expression, a lack of timidity, a lack of self-consciousness, or embarrassment. Now, this earlier description may sound outdated today, especially because it links self-esteem to masculine expression and dominance, but it is important because it shows how psychology often reflects the cultural values of its time. Now, in his investigations, Maslow found that the dominance feeling was linked to sexual satisfaction and marital success. And seeing this important link, Maslow incorporated esteem in his hierarchy of needs model. Maslow's hierarchy is understood as a pyramid of human needs. So at the bottom, you have basic needs like food, safety, shelter, survival. And as you go higher, you get more psychological needs like belonging, esteem, and eventually self-actualization. So by the inclusion of esteem within this model, within popular psychology, self-esteem then became an important component of what human beings must need in order to have a fulfilling life. Notably, Maslow bifurcated esteem into esteem from oneself and esteem from others. So, esteem from oneself pertained to one's self perception of their worthiness, which was rooted in a desire for strength, achievement, confidence, independence, and freedom. Whereas esteem from others was described as social prestige, recognition, attention from others, and appreciation. So, Maslow was saying that esteem has two sides. One side is internal, which is do I respect myself, and the other side is external, do others respect me. But interestingly, in contrast to esteem from oneself, esteem from others received very minimal attention from the psychological or the research community, mainly due to a lack of scientific measures for investigating this idea or this construct. So basically, the psychological community did not go on to create measures for esteem from others, which therefore led the construct not being studied as well, which led to the idea being slowly forgotten over time. Therefore, the consequence of this cycle in this case is that it shaped self-esteem into a primarily individual-centered construct. And this is a key turning point. So, psychology began to focus more on how individuals see themselves and less on how their sense of worth is perceived by their community or ideas like recognition or social belonging. So, overall, by incorporating esteem as a part of basic human needs, Maslow solidified positive self esteem as an important marker for a fulfilling life. With this, self esteem became a central and almost indispensable concept in experimental social and counseling and psychotherapeutic psychologies. So, following Maslow, Carl Rogers' contributions to personality sciences and humanistic psychotherapy also revolved around the notions of the self concept. Now, Rogers highly valued self esteem, and he saw this as an indicator of the congruence between one's real and ideal self. Now, to put this simply, the real self is who we believe we actually are, whereas the ideal self is who we wish we could be. So, when the gap between these two becomes too large, according to Rogers, people may experience distress or psychological suffering. Now, Rogers advocated for psychotherapists to foster self esteem in their clients through unconditional positive regard, which further gave this construct a practical utility and significance. Now, unconditional positive regard means that the therapist offers acceptance and respect without making the client feel judged. So, we could say that Rogers believed that people grow when they feel deeply accepted, not when they are being constantly evaluated. By this point, through its introduction and emphasis in psychotherapy practices, self esteem started to get out of the merely academic circles. However, the biggest boost to this expansion of psychological constructs usually comes when psychologists figure out a quantitative way to measure it in people and to study its relation to important life outcomes. So Dr. Morris Rosenberg, who was an American sociologist and professor, produced one of the inaugural seminal works in the empirical measurement and investigation of the self-esteem construct. So Rosenberg focused on psychometric properties such as content validity, accessibility, and universality, while he was developing his 10-item Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which is also commonly known as the RSES. So this scale became important because it gave researchers a simple way of measuring self-esteem across large groups of people. So instead of only talking about self-esteem or trying to ascertain it based on what does somebody saying, researchers could now ask people directly questions and compare their responses. So through surveys of over 5,000 adolescents in the New York State, Rosenberg validated the scale and also confirmed its reliability in distinguishing between low and high self-esteem individuals. Rosenberg was also able to identify associations between self-esteem and other behavioral and psychological markers such as anxiety, interpersonal attitudes, occupational orientation, leadership potential, to name a few. Moreover, at the population level, now this is very interesting, the RSES showed a negatively skewed distribution. This implies that high self-esteem was a global phenomenon that was being observed broadly across people. In simple words, since many people tend to report higher self-esteem, this helped create this idea that positive self-esteem is natural, normal, and useful. So with this, the concept of self-esteem expanded out of academic or clinical discussions, started to permeate several domains of public discourse. This was especially true in the domain of self-help and parenting literature. So experts advised that fostering high self-esteem in children was important for preventing psychopathology and maladaptive behaviors in later life, and therefore it must be a crucial parenting goal. So this made the construct of self-esteem a part of everyday culture. Parents and teachers were told to build and preserve it within children. Self-help books started to come out that promised to help people improve it. And slowly self-esteem became a strong, sort of understood and commonly held cultural value. So this led to many public policies in the United States as well that were aimed at population level increases in self-esteem. One such example is the California Task Force to Promote Self-Esteem and Personal and Social Responsibility, which operated from 1987 to 1989. The goal was to address social ills like crime, teenage pregnancy, and welfare dependency by treating low self-esteem as a root cause for all these problems. With all these efforts, self-esteem, although still a bit under-theorized in the literature, took on an implicit understanding in Western societies. So why do even humans need self-esteem? All these measurement challenges and research gaps make it important to understand some prominent theories that explain self-esteem's adaptive function. In other words, given that self-esteem is so difficult to measure, it may be interesting or important for us to understand why psychologists might think that something like self-esteem would exist in the first place, or what gives rise to it. Is it just about feeling good about ourselves, or does it serve some sort of an adaptive or an important survival function? So in this section, I will try to cover two prominent theories about self-esteem. So the first one is the sociometer theory. The sociometer theory posits that self-esteem serves as a barometer of one's inclusion within their social group. Now, a barometer is a tool that measures pressure. In the same way, the sociometer theory suggests that self-esteem is kind of a measure for social pressure. It tells us whether we feel or we are accepted, valued, rejected, or excluded by others. So, according to this theory, rather than being a personal motivation, self-esteem is simply the experience of an implicit evaluation of the quality of one's relationship and overall acceptance within their social group. So put simply, self-esteem may work like an internal social alarm system. When we feel accepted, included, and respected, the thing or the feeling that rises is self-esteem. Similarly, when we feel ignored, rejected, or excluded, the thing that drops or the feeling that reduces or goes missing is thing called self-esteem. So this makes this less of a private, self-contained feeling and more of a social signal of some sorts. So it's not only about do I like myself, but instead do I belong. So the other theory I want to cover is terror management theory, or TMT. So this one also asserts a cultural basis for self-esteem. So this theory goes a bit deeper, though. It suggests that self-esteem is not only about social belonging, but also about how human beings deal with one of the most difficult realities of life, sort of like this awareness that life is limited. So TMT argues that self-esteem, or one's intrinsic worth, reflects an individual's or a person's evaluation of the congruence between their self and their actions and their culture's worldview. So the word congruence means alignment. So TMT says that people feel higher levels of self-esteem, or they experience higher self-esteem when they believe that they're living in a way that matches what their culture considers correct or meaningful or valuable or worthy. So why this emphasis on culture? So embedded within the terror management theory, there's an idea that culture offers a few very important things, namely value structures, symbolic explanations of reality, and all of this combined with promises of immortality of some kind. Now, this could be immortality, some sort of a literal immortality through religious ideas, such as the idea of an afterlife, or it could be a type of symbolic immortality through cultural institutions, such as leaving a legacy in the art or the sciences. So, in other words, cultures help people feel that their lives are part of something bigger than themselves. Now, this something bigger can reduce the fears related to the realization that life is temporary. Hence, serving an existential function, TMT claims that high self esteem is the evaluation of living according to one's culture's expectations, which then protects against death anxiety and improves well being. So, from this perspective, self esteem is not just about liking yourself, it may also be about the feeling that your life has meaning in the larger story that the culture gives you. But if self esteem is so deeply connected to belonging, culture, and meaning, then what happens when it becomes disturbed? This takes us into the connection between self esteem, mental health, and therapy, and that's what we will cover next. So, this next one is about how self esteem connects to mental health. Now, self esteem disturbances are associated with poor mental health. This does not mean that self esteem alone explains mental health, but it does mean that self esteem often appears alongside psychological disorders, or dimensions of self esteem appear alongside these disorders. For instance, the DSM 5 makes several references to self esteem. Now, examples could include an inflated self esteem in cases of bipolar or narcissistic personality disorders, whereas low self esteem is mentioned in neurodevelopmental, depressive, or body dysmorphic disorders. This means we often notice changes in self esteem across different psychological conditions. Sometimes self esteem may become extremely elevated, other times it may become extremely low or unstable. However, it is very important to note that the associations found within the DSM refer to correlations that do not establish causality. And this is a very important point. So, just because low self esteem and mental health struggles seem to appear together, it does not automatically mean that one causes the other. Therefore, it remains unclear if low self esteem is causing the psychopathology or is vice versa. So this creates a classic chicken and egg type of question in psychology, and there are two competing models and or theoretical explanations for this. So the vulnerability model suggests that low self-esteem predisposes individuals to mental health disorders. Now, what this model says is that low self-esteem may make a person more vulnerable to psychological distress. So if someone already sees themselves as unworthy, incapable, or inadequate, they may be more likely to interpret their life events negatively. For example, rejection, failure, conflict, or criticism may feel more personally damaging to someone with already low self esteem. Over time, this may increase vulnerability to mental health concerns. So, according to this model, what is happening is that low self esteem is sort of acting like a weak psychological armor of some kind. So, it may not cause every problem directly, but it makes emotional injuries harder to sustain or harder to recover from. The other model is the SCAR model, which is sort of like mental illness as a cause of self esteem model. So, the SCAR model suggests that low self esteem is a consequence of psychopathology, as mental ill health may damage self esteem over time. So, in this model, self esteem is not necessarily the original cause. Instead, repeated psychological suffering can leave a mark on a person and mark on a person's self concept or how they see themselves. So, for example, someone experiencing prolonged anxiety, depression, social struggles, or functional difficulties may gradually begin to view themselves more negatively. That's what the SCAR model is suggesting. This is also why it's called the scar model. So it's saying that the mental health difficulties are sort of leaving emotional scars on someone's self concept. So this creates like a feedback loop. So taking both these models together, researchers sometimes note that both these models may not be mutually exclusive. So this means that they both can be true at the same time. So low self-esteem may increase vulnerability to mental health problems, and mental health problems may further lower self-esteem. So this is what makes self-esteem clinically important. It may not be simply be a symptom, and it may not simply be a cause. It may be a part of a cycle. Therefore, it is not surprising that many schools of psychotherapy emphasize the client's self-esteem or esteem needs for improving their lives and their mental health. So let's start off with the question of how do we measure self-esteem in individuals? According to some estimates, despite over 25,000 publications investigating the self esteem construct, a consensus on its measurement and assessment is still lacking. This is very surprising because self esteem has to be one of the most commonly discussed ideas in psychology, education, parenting, therapy, and also self help. But even after decades of research, we're still unable to answer the question how do we actually measure how much someone values themselves? Now, this is where self esteem becomes more complicated than it first appears. In everyday life, we may assume that self esteem is something quite simple. We may think it's the person either having high self esteem or low self esteem. But when we get to scientific research, the question becomes much harder. Is self esteem something that's stable across the life? Does it change from situation to situation? Can people accurately report it? And can a questionnaire really capture something as personal and complex as to how someone relates to themselves? The RSES, the Rosenberg scale, is useful but limited. So, although the RSES has been validated in cross-cultural and cross-demographic studies, it is still important to note that the RSES construes self-esteem as a unidimensional global construct. It means that it treats self esteem as one overall thing, assuming that the person has a general level of self esteem that can be measured through a short set of questions. So, in this process, it likens self esteem to a personality trait that remains stable across different situations and across an individual's lifespan. Like that's sort of like an assumption that it has. Now, this is useful because it gives researchers a simple way to compare people and groups, but it may also oversimplify the construct. In contrast, research indicates that although individuals maintain a baseline level of self evaluation, situational and contextual factors influence one's time to time evaluations and feelings towards themselves. So, this means that a person may generally have decent self esteem but still feel insecure in a specific situation. For example, someone might feel confident when they're with their friends but inadequate when they are in a classroom or at work or in a romantic relationship or after somebody experiences some criticism. So, self esteem may not be one fixed number. It may be more like a baseline that rises and falls depending upon the context. So, this creates the first major problem. If self esteem changes depending upon the situation, can one questionnaire or can questionnaires truly really capture this? So, problem one is that the self reports may not tell the full story. Now, researchers challenge the use of explicit tests, such as self reported questionnaires for measuring self esteem, and some of them are actually quite vocal about it. So, explicit tests are the one kinds of tests where people directly answer questions about themselves. When you give them a questionnaire and they answer it explicitly, that's an explicit test. For example, a questionnaire might ask someone, do you agree with the following statement, like, I feel like I am a person of worth? That's one example of a question that might be on these tests. Now, these tools are easy to use, but they have one major limitation. They depend on what people are willing and able to say about themselves. For instance, some scholars would argue that self reports would be inherently imperfect for measuring self esteem, as measurements of global self esteem or the complete idea of self esteem for a person must also incorporate and look for and assess unconsciously held views of the self. So people may not always fully know how they feel about themselves. Some self evaluations may be automatic, hidden, or difficult to put into words. Therefore, people cannot be expected to report an accurate and complete picture of their own self concept. Furthermore, self reports of self esteem are susceptible to social desirability bias and sometimes show very poor predictive validity. Now, social desirability bias means that people when answering questions, answer in a way that looks good to others. For example, someone might say that they have high self esteem because they want to appear confident, stable, or emotionally healthy. In terms of poor predictive validity, it means that self esteem scores may not always strongly predict future behavior or outcomes. So, even if someone scores high or low on a questionnaire, that score may not always tell us exactly how they will act in real life. So these are sort of like the issues that have been called out for explicit tests. So the problem is not just that people are honest. The deeper problem is whether people can fully access and report something as layered as a feeling of their own internal self-worth. Now, here is another big problem. Can one question replace the entire scale? Now, this was really intriguing and fascinating. So, the unidimensional conceptualization of self esteem, which is inherent to the RSES, or the Rosenberg scale, lands it in another problem, such as being replaceable with a single item questionnaire. Yeah, so I think this is a major issue. So, what they find is that the 10 item scale sometimes gives almost the same results if you were to ask the person or your participant a single question of, do you see themselves as someone with high self-esteem? Now, this is really interesting. Studies have shown robust evidence to conclude that the single item self-esteem scale, or the SISE, that asks the question, do I see myself as someone who has high self-esteem, shows an almost perfect correlation to the RSES. So replacing the 10 item questionnaire with a single question is producing the same results. This Now, it does not mean that the RSCAC is useless, but it does raise an important question. So, if self esteem can be measured almost as well by one broad question as it can be with 10 different questions, then perhaps the current tools that we have for capturing self esteem are only looking at the surface level analysis of one's view of their self esteem. So, at this point, researchers began asking, what if self esteem is not only what people consciously say about themselves? What if some parts of the self esteem system operate automatically below the awareness? Sort of coming back to the critique that self esteem must hold some unconsciously held beliefs about oneself. So, due to the limitations of self reports, implicit self esteem tests, such as the implicit association test, which was developed by Greenwald and Farham, have been suggested as an alternative. So, what these tests do is that they examine individuals' unconscious associations with the self. So, implicit tests try to measure automatic reactions. So, instead of asking someone, do you like yourself? They examine how quickly and automatically people associate words related to the self with positive or negative words. So, the goal here is to capture self evaluation that individuals may be unable to report explicitly but might react to. So, for example, a person may consciously say, I feel good about myself, but their automatic responses may reveal something that's more complicated. So, implicit test scores are found to be more responsive to individuals' contextual state, indicating that they capture the nuances in changing self perceptions across the lifespan. So, this is something that has been found through research that the implicit self esteem tests have this quality or this benefit. Now, this can be useful because it suggests that the implicit measures may detect subtle shifts in how people experience themselves in different situations. But implicit measures also have problems. These scores are found to be overly influenced by immediate situational threats, such as public speaking. So, if somebody's about to public speak, the scores shift way too much. So, this leads to excessive variability that undermines the reliability of these measures for a complete measure of self esteem. So, in simpler terms, if you think about it, the implicit scores may change too easily. So, if someone is nervous, embarrassed, stressed, or under pressure, their score shifts quickly, and this creates a problem. If a test changes too much based on immediate situations, it may not be a very reliable measure of someone's overall self esteem. Moreover, according to some scientists, implicit measures are also susceptible to desirability biases and also lack predictive validity, sort of the critique for the explicit tests. So, similar in that case. This is important because implicit tests were supposed to solve the problem of the self reports, but if they also struggle with biases and weak prediction, they may not be the perfect alternative. So, this combined with the lack of cross cultural validity has led to the suggestions that implicit tests may not measure self esteem as historically understood. This means that the test may be measuring some automatic self associations, but this may not be the same thing as self esteem as psychologists, therapists, or ordinary people understand it to be. So, in my opinion, this underscores that self esteem cannot be reduced to self related associations observed through automatic responses, negating the need for implicit tests. Rather, self esteem may be much more multifaceted and complex and a reflexive process. So, a reflexive process means that self esteem involves how people think about themselves, feel about themselves, interpret social feedback, remember past experiences, compare themselves to others, and make meaning of who they are. So, all of this is happening um, in real time, and that is what might connect it to this idea of self esteem. So, self esteem may not be one score, one reaction, or one hidden association. It may be an ongoing relationship a person has with themselves. So, that's the idea that I'm trying to present here. Beyond questionnaires, a more complete self assessment, if you think about it. So, as proposed by some researchers, other underutilized evidence based assessment methods, such as clinical interviews, peer ratings, asking the person's friends, and using an observational checklist, should be used to supplement these traditional self reported explicit self esteem measures or also the implicit ones. And this is an important practical point. So, instead of relying on one questionnaire, self esteem may need to be assessed from multiple different angles. A clinical interview can explore the person's life story and self perception in depth. Peer ratings can show how others experience a person's confidence, their insecurities, or self presentation. And observational checklists can also help identify patterns in their behavior, body language, social interactions, and emotional responses. So, together, these methods may provide a more complete, fuller picture of self esteem that self reports alone may fail to provide. But there's another debate that makes the measurements even more complicated. So, what if self esteem is not completely separate from personality? So, this brings me to the big one, self esteem and the big five personality model. So, is self esteem a separate construct or a part of personality? So, another point of contention in self esteem assessment is its correlation with the Big Five personality model, and this is a big one. So, the Big Five is one of the most widely used models of personalities. It includes openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Those are the five main dimensions. The key issue here is that self esteem scores often overlap with some of these personality traits, especially neuroticism and extroversion. So it is firmly established that the RSES scores show a negative correlation with neuroticism and a positive correlation with extroversion. So this means that people who score higher in neuroticism often report lower self-esteem, while people who score higher in extroversion often report higher self-esteem. Okay, so what is the connection between neuroticism, extroversion, and self-esteem? The differences in self esteem scores, therefore, can be explained as an overall difference in the frequency, intensity, and duration of one's experience of negative emotions. So, this is what neuroticism is. Neuroticism is linked to the tendency of experiencing negative emotions more frequently or intensely, such as worry, sadness, insecurity, or emotional instability. Therefore, it can be deduced that a combination of high levels of negative emotion, aka neuroticism, and low levels of positive emotion or extroversion leads to low self esteem or self esteem scores. So, put simply, someone who experiences more negative emotion and less positive emotion may naturally report low self esteem in questionnaires. Now, research shows that people with low self esteem do not only have negative evaluations of the self, but instead tend to express a general negative attitude towards the world. And I believe this is a very crucial point. So, low self esteem may not only be about thinking I am bad, it may also be connected to a broader emotional lens through which somebody sees their life, their relationships, opportunities, and the future. So, maybe it's a more global phenomenon than being something very specific and unique. So now the question becomes, are we measuring self esteem or are we partly measuring a person's emotional temperament? So, what exactly is happening here? So, there are three possible explanations for this. So, some posit that the big five traits influence self esteem. So, you have the personality and then that's affecting someone's self esteem. Others propose models where self esteem is a central construct that explains the differences and the variance in the big five traits. In simpler terms, there are different ways to explain this relationship. So, one possibility is that personality traits shape self esteem. For example, a person high in neuroticism may be more likely to develop low self esteem because they experience more negative emotion. Another possibility is that self-esteem is so central that it shapes how personality traits develop or appear within a person or develop throughout their lifespan. Moreover, some argue that self-esteem independently influences the big five traits, such as by predicting decreases in neuroticism over the lifespan. So as self-esteem remains stable, it helps decrease neuroticism as a person ages. All of this means that self-esteem may not simply be a result of personality, it may also influence personality development over time. Now, because of this, the question of whether it is best modeled through the big five rather than as a unique or an independent construct remains largely unanswered, unfortunately. So, the measurement remains complicated, or the assessment remains complicated for three major reasons. So, this is sort of like the conclusion. So, the first one is that self report questionnaires may not capture the full depth of how people relate to themselves. Secondly, if you try to correct for this through implicit measures, the implicit measures may capture automatic associations, but they may be unstable, or the results are very unstable and sometimes culturally limited. Thirdly, self-esteem overlaps strongly with personality traits, especially neuroticism and extroversion, and this leaves us with a major unresolved question: is self-esteem a stable trait, a changing state, a cultural experience, a personality pattern, or a complex combination of all of these things? And this question is important because how we measure self-esteem would shape how we understand it and how we research it and how we try to improve it or increase it or fortify it within people in therapy. Okay, so now that we've established that a link between self-esteem and mental health exists, the question stands whether self-esteem can be improved through therapy or some other means. Now, connecting to the discussion about Rogers earlier in the video, humanistic therapies often focus on helping people understand and accept themselves more fully. Now, this connects strongly to the idea of self-concept, self-worth, and unconditional positive regard found within Rogerian psychotherapy. CBT, on the other hand, often works by helping people identify and challenge negative thought patterns. So, for example, thoughts like, I'm not good enough, or I always fail, or no one values me, can damage self-esteem over time. What CBT does, it helps people question whether these thoughts are accurate, balanced, or useful. So the question is, what does research say about self-esteem interventions? The good news is that meta-analyses often find that many interventions, including talk therapy, psychoeducation, support groups, art interventions, all of these generally effectively increase self-esteem. It is important because it suggests that self-esteem is not fixed and it can be changed through different forms of support, through reflection, or through some sort of intervention. So in this, CBTs and reminiscence-based interventions that involve re-evaluating autobiographical memories showcase the highest efficacies. Reminiscence-based interventions are especially interesting to me because they involve revisiting personal memories. So instead of seeing one's life through a lens of failure, regret, or shame, in this case, the person is helped to reinterpret their life story in a more balanced and meaningful way. So all of this shows that therapy can sometimes help people rewrite the story they tell themselves about who they are. Interesting to note is that holistic mind-body connection therapies, such as psychomotor therapies, are also found to be highly effective. Now, this reminds us, or this indicates, that self-esteem is not only cognitive. It may not only be about thoughts. It can also be maybe connected to and influenced by body movement, stress posture, emotional expression, and how safe a person feels within their body. Lastly, at a lifestyle level, research indicates a bidirectional relationship between psychological and physiological markers of stress and lower self-esteem scores. So indicating that self-stress management can help buffer against psychopathology by preserving self-esteem. So what we mean by this is that stress and self-esteem can affect each other. Higher stress can reduce self-esteem, and low self-esteem can make stress harder to manage. This means that improving self-esteem may not only happen in therapy, it may also require effort in stress management techniques, healthier routines, emotional regulation practices, sleep, social support, and a stronger sense of control in a person's daily life. What is also interesting to note is that the therapy or intervention-induced improvements in self-esteem are often found to correlate with improvements in mental health markers such as anxiety, reduced anxiety, reduced depression, improved interpersonal life, etc. So improving self-esteem may support a wider range of mental health outcomes. When people begin to relate to themselves differently, this means that they may also begin to relate to others and the world differently, and that it seemed to be adaptive and helpful. But there is one more complication. So if self-esteem is shaped by one's relationships, cultures, and social expectations like we talked before, then we cannot assume that it looks the same for everyone. So this brings us to the crucial question, if the Western idea of self-esteem, is it universally healthy, or is it something that's culturally constructed and understood? So if we understand that self-esteem is not formed in isolation, but it is shaped by a combination of one's family values, gender roles, social expectations, community values, and the larger society that a person grows up in, this means that when therapists or researchers or educators are talking about self-esteem, they have to ask a very important question: whose version or idea of self-esteem are they using? Because what may look like healthy confidence in one culture may look like arrogance in another. And what looks like low self-esteem in one cultural context may actually reflect things like humility, modesty, or respect for their group in a different setting. So before we assume that everyone should express self-esteem in the same way, we need to look at how gender and culture shapes one's self-worth. Talking about gender, large-scale cross-cultural studies find that gender gaps in self-esteem scores exist. Interestingly, in how they change. So men are found to showcase larger improvements in self-esteem during their lifespan development as compared to women. So what happens is that as people age, self-esteem is often found to change and improve with time, but these changes are not found to happen equally for men and women. Notably, in developed and individualistic nations, we see an exaggerated gender gap. To some, this indicates the influence of stereotypes and learned gender roles within patriarchal societies. So the gender gap in self-esteem development or improvement may not simply be biological or natural. It may also reflect how societies teach men and women to see themselves. For example, in many societies, men are often encouraged to develop confidence, assertiveness, independence, and leadership. Women, on the other hand, may face stronger pressures around their appearance, their likability, their emotional responsibilities, and social approval. So over time, these expectations accumulate and can shape how people evaluate themselves. So when we see gender differences in self-esteem scores, we may not be seeing differences in individual psychology as much, or biologically programmed psychology. We may also be seeing the psychological effects of social norms. Furthermore, a Western sample-based notion of this intrinsic motivation to seek high self-esteem may not be generalizable to other cultures. So much of what psychology says about self-esteem, we understand that it is based on Western populations. But not every culture teaches people to prioritize standing out or feeling highly positive about themselves or verbally expressing confidence. For example, Japanese people place a greater emphasis on self-critique rather than self-regard. To a Western audience, self-critique may sound negative, generally negative, but in some cultural contexts, self-critique may be quite adaptive. It may help people improve themselves, maintain a sense of humility, respect social harmony, and stay attentive to their responsibilities. Um, so what appears as low self-esteem through a Western population-based derived questionnaire may not necessarily mean poor psychological functioning for other people. So this is where the self-esteem debate becomes bigger than psychology. It becomes a question of culture. So do all people need to feel highly positive about themselves, or do different cultural settings define healthy selfhood, or this identification with themselves or their intrinsic self-worth, differently? Research finds that collectivistic cultures showcase lower levels of self-esteem compared to individualistic cultures. Some strength-based explanations for this phenomena explain that lower self-esteem scores in collectivistic cultures do not automatically mean people feel worse about themselves. They may simply respond to self-esteem questions differently because their culture discourages exaggerated self-praises. A more nuanced analysis reveals that collectivistic cultures emphasize communal worth more than self-competence or the sense of individualized power. So this means that in collectivistic contexts, self-worth may come less from thinking I am powerful, independent, and exceptional, and more from thinking I am connected, responsible, useful, or valuable within my relationships. So this indicates that a lack of Western-style expression of self-esteem may not be adaptive in a collectivistic context. So maybe the issue is not that collectivistic cultures have less self-esteem, maybe they express self-esteem in a different language. Furthermore, there is evidence to suggest that increasing self-esteem in individuals can disconnect positive emotions from competence or real achievements, potentially leading to narcissistic attitudes. And this is a crucial caution. So, self-esteem interventions are often presented as automatically positive, but increasing self-esteem without grounding it in reality may create problems. For example, if a person is encouraged to feel highly positive about themselves without developing the responsibility or the competence or the humility or accountability, then self-esteem may become inflated rather than healthy. And in this sense, the goal should not be simply to make people feel good about themselves at all costs. The deeper goal may be to help people develop a more accurate, compassionate, and realistic relationship within themselves. Hence, indiscriminate pathologization of low self esteem can risk harming or marginalizing certain individuals or communities. So, if clinicians assume that everyone must express self confidence in a Western individualistic way, they may misunderstand clients whose self worth is shaped by humility, community, or self improvement. So, this does not mean that low self esteem should be ignored. It means we need to understand what low self esteem scores mean within a person's actual cultural and social context.